I never thought moving back to the mountains would bring me this much peace, but also this much trouble, especially when the trouble wore the smug face of an HOA Karen who believed the entire valley fell under her control. The truth was, my family cabin had stood on that ridge long before her suburban development crept up the slope, and while their community had bylaws, fines, and security patrols, none of that ever applied to me, though Karen never seemed to accept it, convinced that. Everything within a 5 mile radius was her jurisdiction, so when I came back to the cabin after leaving city life behind and fixing up the old place my granddad built, I knew it wouldn't be long before she tried something because she had that reputation in town. The woman who stormed into diners demanding discounts because she chaired the HOA board, the one who called the sheriff when a kid's lemonade stand didn't have a vendor permit, the neighbor who measured everyone's lawns with a tape measure and took photos of infractions like someone leaving their trash can out too long. I had heard all the stories from locals, and I admit, part of me was almost curious to see what would happen when Karen realized my cabin, with its woodpile stacked high, American flag waving, and old Harley parked out front, wasn't under her authority, but curiosity quickly gave way to irritation when I came out one morning to find a note pinned to my cabin door, written in that sharp cursive with big loops, informing me that I was in violation of HOA guidelines for storing unsightly firewood in view of the road. And the kicker was that if I didn't remedy the violation, the board would take corrective action. I laughed out loud when I read it, because not only did the road barely exist beyond a dirt trail, but there was no board anywhere near here that had jurisdiction, and my property deed made that crystal clear. So I crumpled the note and tossed it into the fire pit, figuring that would be the end of it. But Karen wasn't the type to give up after one attempt. Within days, she was back, marching up my path in her oversized sunglasses and cardigan, holding a clipboard like it was a sheriff's badge, demanding to know why I had ignored official HOA correspondence, and I simply told her, flat out, that my cabin wasn't in her HOA, never was, never would be, and that she had no authority over me. But she smirked that kind of smirk only Karens can manage, like she knew. Something I didn't, and warned me that all properties in the valley benefit from the HOA's protective oversight. Then she hinted that she could make life very difficult if I didn't comply. I leaned against my porch rail and reminded her this cabin was built by my grandfather, who cut the first trails in these hills long before the HOA even existed, and I made it clear I wasn't about to bow to some self-appointed queen of a subdivision. But Karen's eyes flashed with that glint of a person who feeds off control, and she turned on her heel, muttering about how security would handle it, which made me laugh again, because what kind of security didn't HOA even have mall cops in golf carts? But the answer came sooner than I expected, because the following weekend I woke to the sound of gravel crunching and engines humming, not the deep rumble of Harleys, but the weak whine of cheap SUVs crawling up my driveway, and when I looked outside, I saw two vehicles painted with HOA Security stenciled in big block letters on the side, complete with blinking yellow lights on top, like they thought they were running some kind of private militia, and out stepped four men in mismatched uniforms, khakis with black polo shirts and little badges clipped on, the kind of guys who looked like they couldn't get into the real academy and instead played dress up to feel important. They walked with this fake swagger, one holding a clipboard like Karen had, another with sunglasses too big for his face, and one even had a radio clipped to his belt that squawked every few seconds, though no one on the other end seemed to answer. And sure enough, Karen herself emerged from a passenger, seat lips pursed, arms crossed, acting like she was about to oversee some grand operation, and she shouted up at me from the bottom of the porch stairs that I had been formally cited and that her security detail was here to enforce compliance. I told her plain and simple that she and her toy soldiers were trespassing and had 10 seconds to leave before I called the county sheriff, who actually had authority here. But instead of backing off, one of the so-called guards puffed up his chest and announced they were authorized to enter the property and remove violations, which made me laugh. So hard I nearly doubled over, but the laugh was cut short when two of them actually started walking toward my woodpile like they were going to confiscate logs or something ridiculous, so I stepped off the porch, squared my shoulders, and told them if they set foot past the stone marker at the end of the path, they'd regret it, and maybe it was the tone in my voice, or maybe the way I didn't flinch, But they hesitated, glancing back at Karen for approval, and she waved her hands like some commander urging her troops forward, shrieking about how I had no right to resist enforcement. And in that moment, a thought crossed my mind. I could handle them myself, sure, but it would be far more satisfying to let Karen and her rent-a-cops get a taste of real authority, the kind that didn't wear clip-on badges. So I pulled out my phone, dialed a number I hadn't used in months, and when the familiar voice of my cousin answered, I just said, "Hey, remember how you told me to call if I ever needed backup at the cabin? Well, today might be that day." And he didn't even hesitate before laughing and saying, "We're on our way." And though Karen kept barking orders and her little squad kept circling like vultures, I leaned against the porch rail with a calm smile because I knew it was coming and I knew they weren't ready for it. The minutes ticked by slowly as Karen paced at the edge of my porch like a rattlesnake ready to strike, her security officers lingering awkwardly behind her, not sure whether to follow her lead or pretend they were actually in control of the situation, and I leaned against the porch post with my arms crossed, not saying much because I knew my cousins, three of them, all ex-Army, all brothers, and all loyal to family first, were tearing up the back roads on their Harleys at that very moment, and the anticipation alone was almost enough to make me grin, though I kept my face calm just to mess with Karen's confidence. She hated not being the one in control, and I could see it in the way her lips tightened every time she barked at her goons and they shuffled nervously instead of charging in like she wanted, because deep down they knew this wasn't their fight. And the woods had a way of stripping the false bravado off men who thought clip-on badges and khaki pants made them tough. I checked the time on my watch, heard the faint hum of engines far in the distance, and then I smiled wide enough for Karen to notice, which only made her more agitated as she snapped, "What's so funny? You're in violation and you think this is a joke." To which I replied calmly, "The only violation out here is you trespassing on private land, and I'm about 5 minutes away from having you escorted off by people who actually know what they're doing." And the way her eyes flickered told me she understood that something was coming but couldn't quite piece it together. So she doubled down, ordering one of her men to secure the property while the others took inventory of violations, like this was some military operation, and I nearly burst out laughing again when one of them pulled out a digital camera and started taking pictures of my stacked firewood and the Harley parked under the shed roof, muttering about evidence, as if any county judge would entertain the circus. But the real comedy started when the faint hum grew into a distant rumble, low and steady, echoing off the valley walls like thunder rolling in. And at first, the HOA Security didn't notice, but I sure did. And I leaned off the porch rail, cracked my knuckles, and muttered loud enough for Karen to hear "Showtime," which made her squint in confusion until the rumble grew louder and unmistakable, the deep, guttural growl of Harley-Davidson engines cutting through the mountain air, three of them in unison like a war cry rolling down the road. I swear the birds went quiet for a second, the trees themselves seemed to hush, and then around the bend at the base of the hill came my cousins, each astride a gleaming black Harley, leather vests catching the sunlight, boots heavy on the pegs, sunglasses reflecting the wide-eyed looks of Karen's little crew as they froze mid-step, realizing instantly that they were in over their heads, because no amount of HOA posturing could stand up to the presence of three battle-hardened Army vets who rode Harleys like extensions of their own souls. They came roaring up my driveway, engines shaking the gravel, and when they parked in a perfect V formation at the foot of the porch, they cut the engines at the exact same second, leaving behind a heavy silence broken only by the clicking of cooling engines and the thundering heartbeat of Karen's sudden fear. My cousin Jack, the eldest, swung a leg off his bike first, his tattooed arms flexing as he pulled off his helmet, scanning the so-called security like a wolf eyeing sheep, and in that gravel-deep voice of his, he asked me, "These the jokers giving you trouble?" And I just nodded casually, pointing my chin toward Karen, who suddenly looked much smaller without her clipboard shield, though she tried to keep her chin high, insisting, "This property is under HOA jurisdiction, and we are here to enforce compliance." But her voice cracked on the word jurisdiction, and that was all it took for my second cousin Luke to step forward, smirking as he looked her square in the eye and said, "Lady, the only jurisdiction out here is the deed he owns and the boots on our feet." And then my youngest cousin, Danny, the hothead of the trio, tilted his head and asked me if I wanted them gone because he could make it happen fast, and I laughed and said, "Nah, Let's just watch them talk themselves into a corner. First, because nothing was more entertaining than seeing bullies realize their power was paper thin, the security team tried to stand tall, one even puffing up his chest and declaring, "We're contracted officers, ma'am, don't worry," but his voice shook and Jack stepped closer, towering over him. Close enough that the guy had to tilt his head back, and in a calm but deadly serious tone, Jack said, "Contracted by who? Because last I checked, HOA board members don't have authority to send anyone onto private land, and you boys just committed trespassing," which made one of them visibly swallow hard while another slowly lowered the camera he'd been using. Karen, desperate to salvage the situation, shouted that she would call the sheriff immediately. But that only made Luke laugh because he pulled out his phone, waved it, and said, "Already got him on speed dial, sweetheart, and he knows us real well. Matter of fact, he's probably going to have a good laugh when we tell him HOA, Karen here tried to send her personal rent-a-cops into the woods. And for the first time all morning, Karen didn't have a comeback, just a red flush creeping up her neck as the reality set in that she wasn't in her manicured cul-de-sac anymore. She was on my turf, surrounded by men who'd served in real conflicts, who weren't impressed by clip-on badges and barking orders, and as the silence stretched, Danny clapped his hands together and said, "So, what's it going to be, folks? You going to pack up and roll back down HOA land, or you want us to show you how property rights actually work?" And the look on those so-called security guards' faces said it all. They wanted out, they wanted no part of this, and the only thing holding them there was Karen's pride. But even that looked like it was starting to crumble under the weight of 3 Harleys and the men who rode them. Karen's face was a mask of fury, barely hiding the cracks of fear. The kind of expression you'd see on someone who had spent their whole life wielding power in small ponds and suddenly found herself thrown into an ocean with sharks circling, and while her so-called security team shifted uneasily from foot to foot, clearly wishing they could melt into the trees, she tried to recover her composure by pulling out her phone like it was a weapon, barking into it about violations, non-compliance, and illegal structures, though anyone listening on the other end probably just heard the shrill panic in her voice. Meanwhile, my cousins leaned casually against their Harleys, arms folded, smirks plastered across their faces, radiating the kind of confidence only years of military service and countless deployments could build, and the contrast between them and Karen's trembling guards couldn't have been starker. On one side, men who had faced live fire and marched through deserts with 70-pound packs, and on the other, a few middle-aged wannabes in khakis sweating under the mountain sun, trying to figure out if they could walk away without completely humiliating themselves. I decided it was time to drive the point home, so I stepped off the porch, walked slowly toward the group, and stopped right at the stone marker that separated my private property from the path, planting my boots in the dirt as I pointed to it and said, "That's the line, folks. Everything past this belongs to me, deed and title passed down from my grandfather, and anyone who crosses it without my say-so is trespassing, plain and simple." Then I looked each of the guards in the eyes, one by one, making them drop their gaze before finishing with Karen, whose lips were twitching as she tried to come up with some retort, and finally she shouted, "The HOA governs all properties within a 5-mile radius, and you are not exempt." Her voice trembling as though volume might replace fact, and that's when my cousin Luke burst out laughing so hard he doubled over, wiping tears from his eyes as he said, "Lady, that's not how the law works. Next thing you'll tell us, the HOA controls the whole state," which made Danny snort and add, "Shoot, maybe the whole country if you let her talk long enough," and even Jack, who was usually the serious one, cracked a grin and shook his head like he couldn't believe what he was hearing. Karen, red-faced and shaking now, tried to thrust her phone at me, showing me some HOA bylaws like they were gospel. But I didn't even bother looking because I knew they held as much weight here as Monopoly money, so instead I said, evenly, "Karen, you and your board can write as many little rules as you want, but they don't apply here, and the sheriff knows it, the county knows it, and deep down know it too." And that's when one of her guards finally broke, muttering under his breath that maybe they should leave because this was getting out of hand. But Karen whipped around on him like a viper, hissing that they had a duty to protect the community and that leaving would be dereliction of duty, which nearly made my cousin Danny choke with laughter because the poor guy's expression said he was about 2 seconds from bolting. I could feel the tension thick in the air, that precarious moment where pride keeps someone pushing forward long after common sense has told them to stop. And it occurred to me that Karen was the kind of person who would rather burn herself than admit defeat. So I figured I'd give her one last out before things escalated. So I pulled out my phone, dialed the sheriff directly, and put him on speaker. And when his familiar drawl answered, I said, "Hey, Sheriff, just want to confirm. My cabin is outside HOA jurisdiction, right?" And the sheriff chuckled, replying, "You know it is. Been that way since your granddaddy built it. Nobody has any claim but you." And then I turned the phone toward Karen and her crew, letting his words ring out loud and clear, and the sheriff added, "And if anybody's down there giving you grief, you let me know. I'll be happy to come escort them off personally," which sent visible shivers down the line of guards, their fake confidence draining like air from a punctured tire. Karen, though, doubled down in desperation, shouting into the phone that the sheriff was derelict in his duty and ignoring violations, but the sheriff only laughed and said, "Ma'am, the only violation here is you trespassing where you got no right. Now you best clear out before I send a deputy to do it for you." And with that, he hung up, leaving the valley echoing with the finality of his words. For a long moment, no one moved, the guards staring at Karen like kids caught sneaking cookies, and she stood frozen, fists clenched, jaw trembling, as her whole charade collapsed in front of her. And finally, when even her most loyal-looking guard took a step back toward the SUV, she snapped, "Fine. But this isn't over. You'll regret crossing me." Before storming back to her vehicle, slamming the door so hard the windows rattled, her security trailed after her like scolded dogs, climbing back into their SUVs without another word, and as they turned around awkwardly in the gravel, my cousins erupted into laughter, slapping each other on the backs, Danny practically rolling on the ground as he wheezed. She said, "5 miles? Can you imagine HOA USA? Next stop the White House," while Luke joked about designing a fake national HOA passport just to troll her. Jack, though, stayed quiet a moment longer, his eyes following the SUVs as they rolled down the hill, before finally turning to me and saying in that low, serious tone, "Don't think she's done, 'cause people like her don't stop when they're embarrassed. They double down when they think no one's watching." And he was right. I could feel it in my bones that Karen's retreat wasn't surrender, just a regrouping, and that she'd be back with another scheme, something bigger, something nastier, because her pride had been wounded in front of too many witnesses. I nodded slowly, thanked them for coming out, and promised I'd keep my eyes open, but inside I knew this was just round one in a fight that was far from finished. And while I wasn't afraid, I also wasn't naive, because HOA Karen had just learned that she couldn't win by intimidation, and that meant she'd come at me sideways next time, the way all cornered snakes do. The quiet that settled after Karen's retreat was deceptive, the kind of silence you get before a storm. And even though the engines of her SUVs had long since faded down the mountain road, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was already plotting her next move, because people like her didn't accept humiliation easily. They stewed, they schemed, and they came back twice as vicious. And I knew in my gut that her security stunt was just the beginning. My cousins hung around for a while, parking their Harleys in a neat row under the shed roof while we sat on the porch drinking coffee, laughing about the look on those fake officers' faces when they realized they were out of their depth. But between the laughter, Jack's warning echoed in my mind, and I caught myself scanning the tree line more than once, as if expecting Karen to materialize from the shadows with a new plan. Luke tried to lighten the mood by joking about setting up a no HOA zone sign at the edge of my driveway, while Danny offered to rig up some army-style deterrents, which I knew meant things like motion sensor lights, barbed wire, and maybe a tripwire or two, though I told him we weren't turning the cabin into a forward operating base just yet. But I did admit that having a little extra security might not be a bad idea. Not because I was scared of Karen, but because I knew she was reckless, and reckless people caused damage even when they didn't win. By the time evening rolled around, my cousins had to head out, engines rumbling as they disappeared into the twilight, promising to come back whenever I needed them. And after the roar of the Harleys faded, the valley slipped into its usual mountain stillness, the sound of crickets rising from the underbrush, the hoot of an owl echoing through the trees, and the crackle of the fire pit keeping me company as I leaned back and let the stars fill the sky overhead. But no amount of peace could erase the gnawing thought that Karen would try. Again. Sure enough, 2 days later, proof of her persistence arrived in the form of a letter, not handwritten this time, but printed on official-looking HOA letterhead, delivered by certified mail as though that might make it more legitimate, and inside it accused me of endangering community harmony and listed a laughable set of infractions, including failure to maintain uniform landscaping standards, which was hilarious considering my cabin sat in the middle of a forest, harboring unregistered vehicles, which I assumed was my Harley, though it was fully registered with the DMV. Not that it was any of her business, and even hosting unauthorized gatherings, a not-so-subtle jab at my cousins showing up on their bikes. And at the bottom, it threatened escalating fines, legal action, and potential property seizure if compliance is not achieved, which made me laugh out loud before tossing the letter into the fireplace, watching the flames devour her empty threats. But behind the laughter, I could feel the escalation, the way she was moving from petty harassment to trying to weaponize bureaucracy, hoping I'd cave under the weight of official-sounding nonsense. Instead of caving, I decided it was time to get proactive, so I drove down into town, paid a visit to the county clerk's office, and pulled out every deed, plat map, and boundary survey connected to my cabin, walking out with a folder thick enough to crush her entire argument before it even left her mouth because facts beat bluster every time, and I wanted to be armed with ironclad proof when she tried her next stunt. Sure enough, that stunt came sooner than expected, because the very next weekend I woke up to the sound of heavy machinery grinding in the distance, and when I hiked down to the trailhead, I found a crew of contractors in bright orange vests unloading equipment, chainsaws buzzing, bulldozers rumbling, and right in the middle of it all was Karen, clipboard in hand, barking orders like a general on the battlefield, insisting that they were here to clear unauthorized debris and restore community access paths, which was laughable since there had never been a path through my property except the one my grandfather carved for family use. I stormed down there, folder in hand, waving the deed in front of the contractor in charge and demanding to know who had authorized this work. And when he pointed at Karen, I shoved the paperwork in his face and said, "This property is private. And if you so much as cut a single branch here, you're liable for trespass and damages," and you could see the blood drain from his face as he realized Karen hadn't given him any legal documentation, just her own bluster and a signed contract from the HOA. Within minutes, the entire crew shut down their machines, muttering about not wanting to get sued, and started packing up while Karen shrieked at them to keep working, insisting she would handle the legalities, but they ignored her because no paycheck was worth a lawsuit. I thought maybe that would be the end of it, but Karen wasn't done embarrassing herself because as the contractors left, she turned on me in a rage, shouting about how I was a menace to the community, a selfish loner, and a danger to neighborhood cohesion. Her words spiraling into nonsense until finally she threatened, "If you won't respect the rules, then we'll bring in people who will make you." And that was the moment I realized she wasn't just bluffing anymore. She was gearing up for something bigger, something uglier, and I knew it was only a matter of time before she tried to drag this fight into court or worse, escalate it with more of her fake security antics. But what she didn't understand was that she had just crossed a line because while I could laugh off her notes and letters, trying to send a bulldozer onto my land was a direct assault. And that meant I wasn't just going to defend myself anymore. I was going to go on the offensive, armed with paperwork, family, and the sheriff himself if need be. And if Karen thought she'd seen resistance before, she hadn't seen anything yet. The more I thought about Karen's last outburst, the more it became clear that this feud had passed the point of simple nuisance and had turned into something more dangerous. Because when a person like her starts throwing around words like, "we'll bring in people who will make you," it stops being about silly HOA letters and becomes a matter of someone actively threatening to undermine your rights. And I wasn't about to sit back and let her set the tone. The very next morning, I drove down to the sheriff's office, armed with the thick folder of deeds, surveys, and official county paperwork I had gathered, and sat down with Sheriff Dalton, a man I'd known since I was a kid who knew my grandfather and respected the cabin's legacy as much as I did, and when I laid the entire situation out for him, Karen's bogus letters, the trespassing security, the bulldozer stunt. He listened patiently, then leaned back in his chair with a sigh and said, "Son, I'll be honest with you, she's a thorn." In this county's side, but she's never come after someone with paperwork as airtight as yours. If she tries to escalate, she'll lose, but that doesn't mean she won't try to wear you down first. And I nodded because I already understood that. But then he added, "I'll file a formal record of her harassment and put her on notice. If she or her people step foot on your land again without permission, it's trespassing, plain and simple, and we'll press charges," which gave me a wave of relief. Though I knew it wouldn't stop Karen entirely, just slow her down. Back at the cabin, I doubled down on preparations, making sure my property lines were marked clearly with posted signs, stringing up a few motion-activated trail cameras in case anyone tried to sneak around, and even accepting Danny's offer to help me rig up a couple of harmless but effective noise deterrents, things like tripwire-triggered cans that rattled loudly, enough to scare off intruders without hurting anyone. It felt a little extreme, but with Karen's brand of persistence, I figured it was better to be ready than caught off guard. Sure enough, the next act of her drama played out only a week later, when I came back from a supply run to find fresh tire tracks in the dirt road leading up to the cabin, and when I checked the footage from one of the trail cameras, I nearly choked on my coffee. There she was, Karen herself, leading a group of men in polo shirts and clipboards, not the same security from before, but some new crew she had apparently hired, this time claiming to be property assessors, walking around my fence line and snapping photos as if they were building a case file against me. And though I wasn't home at the time, they hadn't dared step past the stone marker, probably too spooked after the last encounter. But their presence alone proved that Karen had no intention of backing off. I called the sheriff, sent him the footage, and within hours he confirmed that none of those men were licensed surveyors or assessors, just another bunch of cronies she'd hired under the guise of HOA authority, and he promised to pay her a visit with a warning, but deep down I knew she'd twisted in her head as persecution instead of correction, because Karen wasn't the type to learn lessons, she was the type to double down no matter how wrong she was. I tried to focus on normal life for a few days, chopping wood, fishing in the creek, cooking meals in the cast iron skillet that had been my granddad's, but even in those quiet moments, the unease lingered like a shadow, and one evening as I sat by the fire pit with a beer in hand, the low rumble of Harleys filled the air again, signaling the arrival of my cousins, who rolled up grinning, saying they were just checking in, but I could tell from the look in Jack's eyes that he didn't buy my calm act. He sat down beside me, cracked open a beer, and said flat out, "She's not done, you know." And I nodded, telling him about the sew. Called assessors, which made Danny curse and Luke shake his head in disbelief, and then Jack leaned forward, voice low and steady, saying, "She's pushing to see where the line is. Next step, she'll either try to drag you into court with some nonsense suit, or she'll show up again with her people to make a scene." And the way he said it wasn't paranoia, it was certainty, and I knew he was right. That night we sat around the fire, the four of us, talking strategy, like we were back in some tactical briefing, how to document everything, how to keep the sheriff looped in, and if it came to it, how to make sure Karen understood once and for all that the cabin was off limits. The fire cracked and popped, sparks shooting into the night sky, and somewhere in the trees a coyote howled. And I realized that while Karen thought she was the predator in this game, she had no idea she was dealing with a family of wolves who weren't about to let her sink her claws into something that had been ours for generations. When the fire burned low and the stars wheeled overhead, my cousins bedded down in the cabin with me, the Harleys lined up like sentries outside, and as I drifted off to sleep, the thought echoed in my head, Karen wasn't finished, not by a long shot, but neither was I, and if she wanted a war over this cabin, then she was about to learn that some battles couldn't be won with clipboards, bylaws, and fake authority, because some of us fought with something stronger: family, loyalty, and the unshakable right to stand our ground. If there was one thing I knew about Karen by now, it was that humiliation only fueled her fire, and sure enough, just as Jack had predicted, she came back swinging in a new direction, because the next salvo didn't arrive in the form of golf cart security or hired clipboard cronies, but in a thick envelope stamped with legal insignia, delivered by certified mail, and inside was a lawsuit, an actual lawsuit filed in county court accusing me of endangering community safety, failing to comply. with HOA standards creating a nuisance property and obstructing community access routes, a bundle of lies wrapped in enough legal jargon to make someone without preparation fold under the weight of it. But instead of rattling me, it almost made me laugh because I had been expecting this exact move, and thanks to my trip to the county clerk and my sheriff's documentation, I already had everything I needed to crush her case. Still, reading through the absurd accusations filled me with a mix of anger and amusement. She claimed my woodpile posed a fire hazard to neighboring homes. Despite the nearest house being nearly a mile away, she listed my Harley as an abandoned vehicle depreciating community value, though it gleamed like it belonged in a showroom. And she even alleged that my cousins' visit with their bikes constituted gang activity, which nearly made me spit out my coffee laughing. But beneath the comedy of it all, I saw the strategy. She wasn't trying to win in court, she was trying to drain me, to bury me under paperwork, fees, and stress until I caved just to get her off my back. What she didn't count on was that I wasn't alone, because the same day I got the envelope, my cousins rolled up again, engines roaring, and when I showed them the papers, Danny crumpled one page in his fist and growled, "She want to fight in court? Fine. We'll give her one." While Luke pulled out his phone and called a buddy of his who had transitioned from the army into a career as a paralegal, promising he'd hook me up with legal help, and Jack, as always the comm strategist, just said, "Document everything, keep your cool, and let the system work this time. It'll sting her worse to lose in front of a judge than anything we could do out here." And though my instincts screamed to confront her directly, I knew he was right. Over the next week, I worked with Luke's contact, compiling every deed, map, sheriff's record, and video clip into a file so airtight it might as well have been welded shut. And when the court date came, I walked a not with fear, but with confidence, dressed in clean boots, jeans, and a button-up shirt, carrying the weight of my grandfather's legacy on my shoulders, while Karen strutted in with her lawyer, face twisted into a smug grin like she had already won. But the grin cracked the second the judge began asking simple questions. Where in your HOA bylaws does it state you have authority over properties outside the development? A question Karen's lawyer stammered over without an answer. Where is the evidence that this cabin falls under your jurisdiction? Another silence, followed by my neatly presented deed and maps showing the cabin well beyond their borders, and then the final nail when the sheriff himself appeared as a witness and testified that not only was the cabin exempt from HOA jurisdiction, but that he had personally warned Karen multiple times about trespassing and harassment, and I swear, the judge's eyebrows nearly hit his hairline when the sheriff recounted her attempt to send bulldozers up to my land. By the time it was over, the judge dismissed the case with prejudice, meaning Karen couldn't bring the same nonsense against me again. And he even warned her that further harassment could lead to penalties for abuse of process, and while her lawyer slumped like a deflated balloon, Karen herself stood red-faced and trembling, shooting daggers at me with her eyes, as if sheer hatred could undo her defeat. But I just tipped my head politely and walked out of the courtroom free and clear. Outside, my cousins were waiting, engines idling, grins wide, and when I told them the judge had thrown her case out, Danny let out a whoop, so loud it startled a flock of pigeons off the courthouse roof, while Luke said, "Told you she'd fold when she hit real law instead of her HOA fantasy land." And Jack just gave me that slow nod of approval, the kind that meant more than 1,000 words. But even in victory, I knew it wasn't the end. Because Karen didn't operate on logic or law, she operated on pride, spite, and obsession. And sure enough, within days of her courtroom loss, whispers started drifting through town about how she was claiming corruption, insisting the judge was biased, the sheriff was incompetent, and that I was running some kind of intimidation ring with my cousins and their Harleys. And while most folks rolled their eyes and laughed her off, I could tell by the way her HOA board members avoided eye contact in the diner that she was trying to whip them into backing her next move. And I knew it was only a matter of time before she tried something outside the bounds of both law and reason. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the mountains burned orange in a glow, I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, staring out at the dirt road winding down toward the valley, and I thought about how far this ridiculous feud had already gone, how much energy Karen had poured into trying to control something that was never hers, and I realized the fight had turned into something bigger than just me. And her It was a battle between freedom and control, between the rugged independence this cabin represented and the suffocating grip of people like Karen who couldn't stand a world that didn't bend to their rules. And as the cool night settled in, the sound of crickets rising in chorus, I knew in my bones that another storm was brewing, and when it broke, it wasn't going to be in a courtroom or with clipboards. It was going to be something much messier, something raw. And when it came, she was going to find out that I wasn't the one who needed to be afraid. When a person like Karen loses in court, loses face in front of her hired muscle, and loses credibility in town, there are only two paths left. Either she swallows her pride and retreats into obscurity, or she goes off the rails completely. And of course, Karen was never the type to bow her head, so I wasn't surprised when the first real sign of her unraveling came late one night in the form of headlights creeping up my driveway at an hour when even the owls had gone silent. I had been dozing, lightly in the living room, rifle leaning against the wall within reach, because country living taught you to be ready for anything, and the moment those lights cut across the windows, my instincts kicked in like a spark to tinder. I slipped onto the porch in the shadows, staying just out of the beam, and what I saw made my stomach tighten. Two SUVs idling at the foot of my drive, not the same HOA branded ones from before, but unmarked, their engines low, doors opening one by one as a handful of men stepped out, dressed in dark clothes, carrying flashlights, moving with the kind of false confidence that told me they thought this would be easy. For a moment, I thought maybe Karen had finally gone too far and hired actual mercenary types, but as they shuffled clumsily up the path, I realized they weren't professionals, just more wannabes she'd convinced to play along, probably volunteers from her HOA board or some friends she'd bribed with promises of protecting the community, and though they carried themselves like tough guys, their jittery flashlights and constant glances over their shoulders gave them away. Karen herself was there too, standing behind them near the SUVs, arms folded, barking quiet orders like a field marshal, and it clicked in my head, this wasn't about legal battles anymore. This was about intimidation, a last-ditch attempt to scare me into submission after every other tactic had failed. I almost laughed at the absurdity of it, but then my cousins. Words echoed in my head. Jack saying she'd double down, Luke reminding me she'd escalate, Danny promising she'd crack eventually, and here it was, unfolding like some bad play under the moonlight. I didn't waste time. I picked up my phone and dialed Jack, my voice calm as I said, "You might want to wake the boys, we've got company," and he didn't even hesitate before replying. "We'll be there in 15, and sure enough, within minutes the faint, familiar growl of Harleys began to rise in. The distance, faint at first, then louder, echoing off the ridges like rolling thunder, and though Karen's little squad hadn't noticed yet, I could already picture the look on their faces when the cavalry arrived. Meanwhile, I stepped out of the shadows onto the porch, my silhouette outlined against the cabin lights as I called down to them, "You're trespassing. Turn around now before you make a mistake you can't take back." And the men froze mid-step, flashlights jerking nervously as one of them muttered, "Maybe we shouldn't, but Karen Sharp has cut him off," her voice slicing through the night. "Keep going. He doesn't own this land. The HOA does." A lie so bold, I couldn't help but bark out a laugh, and that laugh carried just far enough for the low rumble of Harleys to suddenly cut through the night, a sound so primal and commanding it seemed to shake the ground under our feet. The men spun around toward the road, flashlights trembling as three black bikes emerged from the darkness, headlights blazing, engines roaring like war drums. And there they were, Jack, Luke, and Danny, riding up the gravel with grim faces, leather vests, catching the moonlight. Every inch of them radiating authority, the kind you can't fake, the kind that comes from surviving deserts, jungles, and cities half a world away. The so-called intruders froze completely now, caught like deer in the beam of something they didn't understand, and the moment my cousins cut their engines in perfect unison, the silence that followed was heavier than a stone wall. Jack dismounted first, boots crunching on gravel as he stepped forward, his voice calm, but carrying like thunder. "You've been warned before. This is private property. Leave now, or we'll make sure the sheriff adds criminal trespass to your record." And though his words were measured, the steel underneath them left no doubt. He meant every syllable. Luke flanked him, arms crossed, smirking at the trembling men as he added, Hope Karen here has deep pockets, 'cause lawsuits get real expensive when you're on the losing side, and Danny, never one for subtlety, cracked his knuckles and growled, "Or we can settle this the old-fashioned way, if you'd rather." And the combination was too much for Karen's little squad, because one by one they backed away, flashlights dipping, muttering excuses about not signing up for this, until finally only Karen herself remained, standing stiffly by the SUVs, her face pale, but her eyes blazing with manic pride, and she shouted across the night, "This isn't over. You can't intimidate me. The community won't stand for this lawlessness." But her words sounded hollow now, bouncing off the trees with no echo, drowned out by the weight of the Harleys and the men who rode them. I stepped off the porch, met her eyes across the gravel, and said evenly, "You've lost, Karen. Every trick, every scheme, every lie, you've thrown it all and none of it worked. Go home. Stay home. And if you ever come back here with another crew, the sheriff won't just give you a warning, he'll haul you off in cuffs." And for the first time, I saw a crack in her armor, her lips trembling, her breath uneven, though she still tried to mask it with a scowl. Without another word, she spun on her heel, climbed into the SUV, and slammed the door, her so-called followers piling in behind her like rats abandoning a sinking ship. And as the taillights disappeared down the road, the night fell. Quiet again, broken only by the chirp of crickets and the low hum of cooling Harley engines. Danny broke the silence first with a bark of laughter, slapping Luke on the back and saying, "Did you see their faces? They looked like kids caught sneaking beer from their daddy's fridge," while Luke grinned and added, "Karen's running out of people dumb enough to follow her. Pretty soon she'll be standing out here alone with her clipboard." And even Jack, ever the serious one, cracked a smile before turning to me and saying, "She's close to breaking, cousin. One more push and she'll either quit or hang herself with her own rope." And I knew he was right, because that night I had seen it in her eyes. The rage, the desperation, the pride crumbling under its own weight. And I realized the storm wasn't just about to end, it was about to implode. And when it did, Karen would finally have to face the truth she'd been running from all along. She couldn't win, not here, not against me, and not against family that rode in together like a wall of thunder. For a week after that midnight standoff, the mountain felt calm again. The kind of calm that comes when even the air knows a storm has finally broken. But I wasn't naive enough to think Karen had disappeared entirely, because people like her don't just surrender, they either vanish in disgrace or go out swinging with one last desperate move. And as it turned out, she chose the latter. I first heard the rumblings at the diner when an old rancher leaned across his plate of eggs and bacon to whisper that Karen had been petitioning county officials to condemn my cabin on the grounds that it was unsafe for habitation. And though most folks laughed at the absurdity, I felt the familiar weight in my gut that meant trouble was coming. And sure enough, 2 days later, a county inspector's truck pulled up my drive, the man inside looking both uncomfortable and apologetic as he explained he had been compelled to check the property after numerous formal complaints filed by the HOA. I showed him around politely, pointing out the sturdy beams, the reinforced foundation, the up-to-code wiring, and the fire extinguisher tucked by the stove. And by the time we finished the tour, he shook his head with a smile and said, "This place is safer than my own house. Looks like someone wasted my time." And with that, he drove away, leaving me shaking my head at Karen's persistence. I thought maybe that would be the end, but no. 2 nights later, she marched right up my driveway in broad daylight, no army of volunteers, no fake security, just her clutching a thick folder like a weapon. And when I stepped onto the porch, she launched into a tirade that echoed off the trees. "You've embarrassed me. You've humiliated me in front of my board, my neighbors, the whole community. Do you think you've won? You think this is over? I'll never stop, do you hear me? Never." Her voice shrill, her face red, her hands shaking as papers spilled from the folder onto the gravel like feathers from a torn pillow. And for the first time since this whole mess started, I didn't feel anger, I felt pity, because here was a woman so consumed by her obsession with control that she couldn't see the wreckage she had made of her own life, her own reputation, her own sanity. I told her calmly, "Karen, you've already lost. You've lost in court, you've lost your people, you've lost any credibility you had in town. All you're doing now is burning yourself down with the last matches you've got left." And for a moment she froze, her eyes darting back and forth like she was searching for some line, some insult, some trick to throw back at me. But nothing came, just silence and the faint sound of a Harley engine growling in the distance, as if on cue. Jack, Luke, and Danny rode up the drive. Not in force this time, just the three of them like always, and when they cut the engines and stood beside me, Karen's. Shoulders sagged, her fury draining into something smaller, almost fragile, like a balloon with a slow leak. She spat one last weak line. This isn't fair, none of this is fair. And then she turned, stomped back down the gravel, climbed into her SUV, and roared away without looking back. And though I half expected her to return with another scheme, she never did, because that was the breaking point, the moment when even her own pride couldn't drag her back into a fight. She had already lost a dozen times. In the weeks that followed, word spread quickly that Karen had been voted out of her position on the HOA board, neighbors finally tired of her antics, and though she tried to mount one last campaign to rally them, no one showed up to her meetings, no one listened to her rants, and eventually she slipped into the background, a woman with no more power, no more audience, just whispers of her downfall echoing around town. Meanwhile, life at the cabin returned to what it should have been all along. Quiet mornings with coffee steaming on the porch, evenings with a crackling fire and the sound of crickets outside, weekends when my cousins would ride up the mountain, engines rumbling like old friends announcing themselves, and we'd sit around the fire pit laughing, telling stories, reminding ourselves that family, loyalty, and freedom were worth more than any HOA rulebook or clipboard could ever claim. Sometimes locals would stop by with a pie or a six-pack, shaking my hand, and saying, "Heard you stood up to Karen, about time someone did," and I'd smile and nod, not out of pride, but because I knew this fight had never just been mine. It had been about everyone who wanted to live without chains disguised as community guidelines. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the mountains gold, Jack turned to me and said, "You realize, cousin, you didn't just win, you set a line in stone. People like Karen will think twice before they try something like this again, because they'll remember the cabin in the woods where the HOA failed." And I knew he was right, because stories like this don't just die, they ripple out, turning into legends people pass around like warnings. And as I sat there with the fire crackling, the smell of pine in the air, my cousins by my side, and the memory of roaring Harleys echoing in my chest, I finally let out a long breath and felt the weight lift, because I knew the war was over, the cabin was safe, the mountain was mine, and Karen, well, Karen was just another cautionary tale about what happens when you pick a fight with someone who refuses to be broken.